Alright, so today we're going to be installing a G&G ETU Mosfet into a CM18 Mod1. As you can see, this is a brand new gun that the customer purchased, except he wants to have the ETU in it. Now, on a lot of guns, you can buy G&G guns where the ETU is standard equipment. On this particular model, it is not, so we're going to go ahead and make it into standard equipment for it. So first thing we're going to have to do is go ahead and disassemble the gun and take out all of the regular trigger parts and give it the upgrade with the ETU Mosfet. So let's see how this goes. So to put a MOSFET in, we need to change out the selector plate. If you notice with the new MOSFET, they will give us a all-new selector plate in here. Just remove some of this stuff. So you can see there's a new selector plate in there. To take out the old selector plate, you have to remove the safety. So we're going to start with that. That is just simply one screw that holds the safety mechanism in here. With some of the first versions of these that came out, they gave you a whole new safety lever, and I don't see them with the latest version. So I'm assuming that the standard safety lever is now compatible with what's going on with the ETUs. When we remove the selector plate, there's a very small spring that goes between the selector plate and the cutoff lever. That's what operates the cutoff lever. So we need to be able to get that out of there without it flying across the room. Sometimes you can get in there with like a pair of tweezers or something. I'm going to use a small dental pick and just remove it like this. I'm just going to stick a dental pick into it and pull it out. So there is the, you can see that's the little spring that goes in there. Very easy to lose, and they don't give you spares of those. We're going to pry out our selector plate. We'll just come out like this. Just pull it out the other way. So you can see the difference between the two selector plates, and essentially you could very easily convert this into the ETU style. You could see that there is a tab here and there is not a tab here. In fact, if you look closely, you could see there was a tab there, and it looks like they just chopped it off or broke it off because the edges are still somewhat jagged where the old tab was. So you could tell this is one that uses a manual trigger. This is one that's using an ETU trigger. So we're going to replace that. Also, if you've seen some of the videos that I've done on these, there's a specific little mod that I like to do on these gearboxes when we're doing ETUs on them, because ETUs have more wires than the standard triggers, and getting all of those wires to fit through the gearbox without them rubbing on the gears or other parts is somewhat difficult. So we're going to cut a little channel in there for the wires to run through. Now I'm just going to go ahead and strip the gearbox all the way down, and we'll just put it all back together once we have made this modification. So pull this cutoff lever out, just put it in our tray. So this gearbox is completely torn down. What we're going to do is drill a hole here and here, and then we're going to connect the two holes and create a path for the wires to fit in. So what I'm going to want is for the hole to be right up against where the screw plate is right here. You can see there's two areas here and here where the screws, where the grip screws into the gearbox. So I want the holes to be just on top of those two reinforced areas where the screws go. So we're just going to put the bit down right about there. I'm going to Drill that out. Let the drill do the work. And then we're going to do another one right here, right on top of the other area where the screw comes through. So get this guy here. So now you can see we've got two holes in there. As I was saying earlier, this is where the screws come through for holding the grip on here and here. They come out through here, and then I like to just put the two holes right on top of those two slots, which gives us this. And then what we're going to do is take our Dremel. So this is just an abrasive cutting disc. We're going to put this on here. So let's flip this on, and here we go. There we are. So now you can see we've got a little channel cut through the gearbox. What I'm going to do next is just take a little cutter bit and just clean that up so that there's no jagged edges on the metal. You don't want to be running wires through that and then have the wires get damaged because the edges of the hole or this channel is too sharp. So we're just going to take a little cutter bit. So I don't know if you could tell or not, but what I was essentially doing was trying to bevel the sides of that little channel so that the wires have a nice clean path to go through. You could also probably get in there with a small file and clean it up that way. There's a number of different things that you can get in there to make sure that's a nice clean path through there. And then that is pretty much that. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of some of this mess here. And one thing I would say, if you're doing work on a gearbox with any kind of cutting in there, it's a good idea to get in there and clean it out as much as possible, because you don't want any of that metal debris to get into your gears and, you know, the more sensitive parts of the gearbox. So this gearbox is now prepped and ready for the upgrade. First thing we could do is just go ahead and put the bushings back in. They just simply drop into the little slots here. Next thing I think I'll do is put the selector plate in. So I'm just going to tap, make sure they're sitting nice and flush. Selector plate is going to go in here. And remember, we're using the selector plate that does not have the tab right here. So that's going to just simply slot into here. So what I've had to do on a number of occasions is to take a pair of wire cutters and just sort of cut off the bottom edge of the selector plate so that it'll fit into the proper spot. It doesn't seem to affect the selector plate once it's been installed, because it usually doesn't travel beyond there anyway. So we've got our selector plate in. Next thing would probably be to put in the safety. So there's a little lever that goes here, and then on the opposite side there is a spring, and then there is another lever here that fits in. And then there's just simply a screw that holds this all together. So that is our safety. So you can see when the selector plate pushes forward, it pushes on this lever, which operates the lever on the opposite side as well. Probably go ahead and put our cutoff lever in there. That's just going to drop in like that. That has a little screw in the middle of it that holds that in place. So we now have our cutoff lever. We could go ahead and put the cutoff lever spring in as well. That's going to go, the spring is going to go between these two tabs here. So you just simply put it onto the tabs, fit it in place, and that's pretty much it. Very easy to lose that spring, so it's a good idea to get that out of the way. We can go in, and probably best bet would be to put the trigger in. So this is the trigger switch here. I would think that it would be a pretty good idea to install the wires into the trigger before you install it into the gearbox. So you have it's essentially like a data cable that goes between the circuit board and the trigger switch. And it's pretty much a one-way proposition since the connectors are unique on each side, so it's not like you can put it in backward. So we've got our trigger switch with the data cable connected. There's a channel that goes around and under that you want to put the wires through. So the wires are going to slot through essentially like that, so that they go under this little piece. This little tab here on the bottom, I've gotten in the habit of removing part of that because it interferes with the trigger spring. So to make life easier, what I've gotten into the habit of is taking a razor knife and cutting off the bottom quarter of that tab. I'll show you in just a second so you can see. So if you could see, I'm removing the bottom half of this so that the spring will have a place to go. Otherwise, you could leave it there, but it makes your life pretty difficult trying to get the trigger to sit properly like that. This is going to need a screw to hold it in place. So there we go. So now we have the trigger switch installed. One thing that's important when you're installing an ETU is that you get the cutoff lever to mate up properly with the trigger switch. Essentially, you have your cutoff lever, which is this metal lever here, which is going to press on this small red lever. When you're looking at the trigger switch, it looks like this. So your cutoff lever has to fit underneath that lever. So as it presses up, it activates the little sensor inside of the trigger switch so it knows that the gun has fired a shot. So how does it know that? Well, when you're looking at the back of the sector gear, you'll notice that there's a small cam or a lobe. It's a teardrop shaped device. So as the gear rotates, you can see it activates the cutoff lever, and that trips the little red lever on the ETU, and that lets it know that the gun has gone through a full revolution or it's fired a shot, and then it stops shooting so that you have to release the trigger and then pull it again to fire another shot. So that's how your semi-automatic works on an ETU gun. We are also going to need to install the motor wires. These two wires are going to go to the motor. You can see from the previous installation how long the wires should be. The red wire should be in the front of the gearbox and the black wire should be in the back of the gearbox. And you can see here, this went around this way here. So I'm going to say right about to here. So that's how long the wire is going to need to be. So I'm just going to match it up with the new wire, so we can figure out where to bend this. We're going to say right there. So this wire is going to go through here and up. And we have our black wire. Since we know how long the red wire is going to be, the black wire will just follow suit. And then we will put our little data cable through here as well. Just going to fish down and around and through our little channel that we've cut into there. And that's going to go up and out the back. So then once we've got these roughly placed where we want them, we can put the clips in there. The G&G includes some little metal clips that go here and here that keep the wires tucked in nice and neat. You have to be somewhat careful when you're installing that, because I've seen it where the wires get pinched by the little metal clips and then it shorts them out and then they don't work, or worst case scenario, your MOSFET catches on fire. So when you do this, just make sure that the clips are not rubbing against the wire. Sometimes you have to sort of mold them with your fingernail to get the right size so that they fit into place. These actually, if you do it right, make your life a little bit easier, because it keeps everything nice and snugly held into place, so you don't have to worry about it popping out while you're working on other parts of the gearbox. So that is a nice feature. Not something you absolutely need to use, but I would recommend making use of it, because it's worked out well for me so far. So we're up to this point. We're going to put some gears in here. The original gears are the standard stock ones. We're going to upgrade these to 13:1 gears. So he's going to have a faster gear ratio. So I'm just going to use the existing shims off of the previous installation. And the bevel gear will work just fine in this. We don't need to have a special bevel gear. In some cases, when you buy 13:1 gears, it comes with a bevel gear, and sometimes it does not. It doesn't really matter. It uses the same tooth pattern as a standard bevel gear, so that really doesn't affect your installation at all. So we're going to go ahead and install our gears. We have our sector gear, our spur gear, and our bevel gear. And then we also need to install our anti-reversal latch. This has a very small spring on it. Should look just like that. This goes onto there, and we've got our bevel gear, and that is pretty much all of the gears up to this point. So we can continue with putting the piston and spring and stuff back in. It will use the same spring on the tappet plate. Sometimes stretching these over onto the little tab can be a little bit of a challenge. I just use a dental pick to grab it and hook it over the tab so that that sits where it needs to be. So we've got our cylinder and our tappet plate all put back into place. We have our piston fits together like that, the spring and the spring guide, and then the very last thing I like to do is the modification to the trigger so that you can get faster trigger response. With the original triggers that came onto these, it had a metal piece that would push against. If you could see inside of the trigger switch, this very tiny little switch in here, this piece of metal would press up against that, and we found over time that this would actually eventually crush that little trigger switch, because if people were too heavy-handed with it, it would just mash that down, and then it would die an early death. So in newer releases of this, they added a spring onto there. If you can see, this is a metal spring that wraps around it, so this has a little bit of give to it as it presses on the trigger switch in there. But you can see there's still about a 1/4 inch of movement in there. What we want to be able to do is make it so that it's pressing, or it's resting up against the trigger switch, so that you don't have to move the trigger in as far of a movement in order to fire the gun. So we're just going to take up that extra little space with some neoprene rubber. Essentially, I usually just cut up a rubber washer, uses a nice soft neoprene on it. So we're cleaning off both surfaces and put a little dot of super glue on it. Just have to be patient and wait for the glue to set up. Typically super glue will set up in a few seconds. You don't have to hold it down all day, maybe a minute or so. But so you can see we've glued a piece of rubber onto the spring that presses on the trigger switch. You could also use like a sander like this to just trim it down a little bit. So the end result is that we now have a piece of neoprene rubber glued to the side of the spring, and that will essentially make this into a speed trigger. There's no, the only difference between this and like a commercially bought speed trigger is some of those have set screws that you can adjust the amount of play in it. With this, you're pretty much just set with one setting, so you don't have a lot of ability to change how the switch interacts with the trigger. So we're going to drop this in. Needs to go in a little hole. And if you could see in here, the trigger spring fits in between the gearbox housing and this little tab here, so that actually gives it a place to go without making that little mod. It's a real pain in the neck to get that thing to fit where it's supposed to go, so you may want to use that solution on your own builds in the future. So we're going to put some shims on the top of the gears. So everything is all shimmed up. We've got our wires run through there. We've got our spring, our piston, our cylinder, our tappet plate. Everything is now in place. Might be a good idea to put a shot of silicone on the gears so that they are lubricated properly. I've just been preloading these little syringes with a little bit of silicone grease. So I'm just going to put a little shot on the gears here, and here, and here, and that will work itself onto the rest of the teeth of the gears as it spins inside of there. One other thing that's worth mentioning is that there are two tabs, one here and one here, that can interfere with the little clips that are holding the wires in. So if you've elected to put those clips in there, it might be a good idea to go ahead and trim back these little tabs here and here. That way those are not interfering with those clips. You might find it harder to get the gearbox to seat all the way. So I'm just going to clean those off a little bit. So, and then once again, as I said before, it's a good idea to clean it out real good. If you're doing any sort of grinding on it, you don't want to get any more metal debris in there than you need. So now we're ready to go ahead and put this all back together again. Go ahead and compress our spring. Gearbox should just snap into place. And as usual, sometimes these are easier than others. Sometimes they just drop right in, and in other days you've got to fiddle with them quite a bit to get everything to fall right into place. It's a good idea. I usually like to move things like the tappet plate and the trigger. That way I'm sure that they're moving freely. And a lot of times when you move the tappet plate, it sort of jiggles the gears into exactly the right position. So you want to make sure your wires aren't being pinched off or anything like that, and that all the parts are moving freely that need to be able to move. And then you can go ahead and finish reassembling it at this point. So there we go. Everything's all buttoned up. The wires are all run. The trigger moves. The tappet plate moves. Might be a good idea to test fire it once just to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do before you bother to fully reassemble the gun. What we're going to do is go ahead and connect our data cable onto the MOSFET. Like that. It comes with a piece of shrink tubing, which once you've got it fully assembled, you can shrink tube that down. We're just going to test all of this and make sure we don't have any shorts, and make sure that the motor actually cranks up when it's supposed to. And one thing I would also mention with these, if you're doing the higher speed gears, it might be a good idea to swap out the Tamiya connectors with Dean's connectors. If you're just doing standard gear ratios, you can get away with the standard connectors on them, but if you're doing high speed stuff, they tend to heat up. So you can see the motor cranks, so we are well underway here. Yeah, if you're running higher speed motors and higher torque gears, you may want to go ahead and switch over to Dean's. So you'll have to just play it by ear. I've seen the Tamiya connectors actually melt to the point where they actually fuse to each other, and you can't unplug the battery with it because it generated so much heat it actually melted itself in place. So something to consider. So we're going to go ahead and finish reassembling this gun. This is a rear wired gun, so the MOSFET wires are going to go through the back just below where the buffer tube connects. We have our motor wires. This is all going to go here. I usually like to put the pins in first before I do anything else, because otherwise the gearbox can tend to shift once you start putting other screws in there like the buffer tube and the grip. So get your pins in first and then put your grip screws into it. There's a little channel right here and right here which the grip will slide up onto. So you want to make sure your wires are not going to interfere with that. So we're just going to run our wires into the grip here. Like that. We're going to put our grip screws back in. Get these fairly snug. I like to get the first one in and leave it in a little bit loose, and that way when you put the second screw in, it will line up properly. Otherwise, if you put the first screw in and torque it all the way down, it can shift it in a weird way. So try to get them both in there before you start snugging them all the way down. And you can see here when you look into the grip, you want to get your motor wires to go down the bottom of the grip and then up the sides. So they should look something like that where they are not going to interfere with the motor. This channel that's made by this screw, or where the screw goes into the grip, gives a nice convenient place to run the wires up along the side. That way the grip is able to move freely. Essentially, you want the motor to be able to freely float inside of the grip, so when you put it in there, it should be able to move up and down fairly easily without the wires pinching it off. So these are brand new wires, so we'll have to bend the connectors. So we're going to go ahead and put the spade connector in, and then just bend the connector so that it sits flush like that. The red wire is going to run around the side of it and then connect to the motor, so it's going to go like this. It's so much easier to install brand new wires than wires that have already been bent into shape, because sometimes they don't always want to go exactly where you want them, where in this case you can actually mold them to exactly the position that you need. So then our motor plate is going to go in there like that, and then the screws that hold the motor plate in, I'll just need proper driver bit for that. And since this was the original motor with the original motor plate, I'm hoping that the motor height will be where it needs to be from the original installation. It may need to be adjusted a little bit. We'll just give it a listen when we hook it all up and see what we're working with. I kind of like to do it in stages before I do the final, heat shrinking and all that on everything, to make sure that everything is doing what it needs to, because it's kind of a pain in the neck to fully assemble the gun and then have to completely disassemble it because something is not working properly. So before I do all of the assembly work, I like to double check my work, make sure that everything is functioning properly, and then I'll know. So we're getting semi-auto and full auto is working, so that's good. So now I feel perfectly comfortable with completing the assembly at this point. So what we've got is our buffer tube. It's important when you do this that you run your wires through whatever sling mount you have, because if you put the wires through the buffer tube and you haven't done this, you're going to have to take it all back apart again. So get your wires run through there. The way I like to do the MOSFET wires is I will run the wires coming from the MOSFET through from this direction. If you can look into there, I don't know how well you can see that, but there's a little hole in the middle of it that it's like a little smiley face that the wires are going to fit through. So we'll run our motor wires through here and our MOSFET data cable through the opposite direction. So this is going to come out here. We can go ahead and connect our motor wires. If you want to be extra cautious, you can put shrink tube over the shrink tube. That sort of locks these in place. We've noticed here, especially with rental guns, where people are constantly changing the length of the stock, that eventually it does pull those wires out. It's not like a catastrophic problem, it's just an annoyance. If it's your own personal gun and you're not doing a lot of, if you're setting the stock length and then leaving it alone, then it's probably not going to be an issue. You just have to play that by ear, and if you start running into problems with your motor wires coming disconnected on a regular basis, the solution's fairly simple with a little bit of shrink tubing in there. So we're going to get our buffer tube screw in. Need a longer screwdriver to get that all the way down in there. I want that to be nice and snug. So we've got our buffer tube screw in. We can run our wires through the stock like this. this particular guy may want a different stock on this thing eventually, so for now I'll just give him this particular, the original stock that came with it, the stock, and then if he wants to go to a different stock, he can make that determination later. So our connector is going to go in here. In fact, I may hold off on shrink tubing this until I'm sure that he wants to go with the original stock, or if he wants to go with the modified. A lot of guys like to use the stubby stocks on there because they have a much larger battery compartment, so we'll leave that up to him for later. So we've got our mag catch. Go ahead and put that in. Had a guy bring one of these in the other day that the mag catch was not working properly. Turns out he had spray painted it so much that the holes that the mag catch fits through had totally gotten caked up with spray paint. So if you decide to paint your gun, it's a good idea to mask these sort of things off so that they don't give you trouble. Since this is now a MOSFET, this is very well suited for using LiPo batteries, so this will work particularly well with the higher speed that you'll get from the better gear ratio. So you get a much faster trigger response on this. So the other part of this mod, this particular build, is the guy wants to have his tracer unit in it, and he wants to have a little bit of a shorter barrel, so that what happens is when you put the tracer in, it's got a nice flush fit to it. What we're going to do is cut down the inner barrel so that this fits into there, so that just the end of the tracer is coming out. So let's go ahead and take this apart so that we can make that modification. Since this is a new tracer unit, I'm going to go ahead and plug it in and get this thing charging for him. These do come with a little bit of a charge from the factory, but it's always good to top it off, especially if they're coming to use the gun, which is normally the case with the majority of our custom builds, is people want to, pick it up and immediately use it that same day. So they're usually expecting that everything will be up and running when they get it. So let's go ahead and pull our handguard off of here. Just going to send that over here. On these, the handguard should just pull right off. And you can see this there's still a little bit of space on the outer barrel, so we're gonna want to chop that down. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is remove the inner barrel. Take that out, set that aside. We're going to remove the flash hider because this is going to be of no use. One thing I've noticed with G&Gs that I am very happy about is that they've been using less glue on their flash hiders. It used to be we had to torch these things with so much heat to get the glue to break free that a lot of the times it would destroy the flash hiders. Lately I've noticed that it seems like there's less glue being applied, and we can a lot of times break it free without having to completely destroy the flash hider in the process. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case today or not. It's moving. What I like to do is just wiggle it back and forth until the little pin comes free, and then you can usually just manually remove it from it. This is a huge difference from the way it used to be. It used to be so much glue on these things that you just almost could not get flash hiders off of them without destroying them. I think, especially with the prevalence of how many people are going to muzzle devices like tracer units and stuff like that, it almost seems silly at this point to be putting the flash hiders on permanently, because I would say almost everybody that purchases one of these eventually removes the factory flash hiders and stuff from it. It's always good to get the excess glue off of the threads before you put anything else on it. You could just use a wire brush, or you can use a wire wheel. I'm going to use the wire wheel, I believe, because there's still a lot of gunk caked up in there, so this will make it a little bit easier to clean it out. So that's a little bit cleaner. All right, so our next thing we want to do is take about an inch off of this outer barrel. In order to do that, what I'm going to do is cut this down. So we'll just take our Allen wrench and we're going to remove the front part of the outer barrel. One of my pet peeves about this, if you've watched any of the videos, you may have seen that these Allen screws are never Loctited into place, which is nice in this case where we're working on it and we don't have to break all the Loctite free, but it also is a pain in the neck with using the gun, that eventually these set screws work themselves free and your barrel ends up falling off. So I'll just reiterate my little thing on if you ever get one of these guns, it's always a good idea to pull all of your set screws and Loctite them so that they don't work themselves off. So we're going to cut this down to about, I'm going to say right about here. All right, so we're going to cut down the outer barrel so that it's going to shorten this so that the tracer unit will fit flush onto the end of the handguard. We don't want to have too much of the tracer unit protruding out of the end. So it's just going to be a nice little custom look to it. That'll also make the gun just a tad bit shorter, about an inch shorter, but I think that should be adequate for what we're doing here. Actually, I'm going to leave that out because we're probably going to need to cut the inner barrel down as well. So I'm just going to square this off nice and neat. And then we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of Loctite on there so that all of our work doesn't fall apart later. Get the little pieces of wire out of my fingers. So I'm just going to get a little piece of paper and just put a drop of Loctite on there. We'll use that to Loctite our set screws in place. So just take this out. Get a little bit of Loctite on it. This is probably one of the single most handy things that you can do if you have a G&G. Of all the things, that you can complain about with different guns that are out on the market, this is really the only Achilles heel that I have known for this particular brand, is the issue with the outer barrel, with them popping off, and it's such a simple fix. I'm a little bit shocked that, you know, they haven't done it from the factory, because other than that, everything else about the manufacture and the quality of these guns are superior to just about everything else that's out on the market. So hopefully one day they'll get the memo, and I will have absolutely nothing to complain about with their particular brand. My only real concern with G&G is that they're in Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China really want to take back Taiwan one of these years, and I'm somewhat afraid for the people of Taiwan that they have that shadow hanging over them all the time. God knows we love their products here, but you know, it's a real flashpoint in the world, and you know, it's hard to ignore that. I couldn't imagine living in that part of the world with that being a constant threat. So here's hoping we don't ever have anything major happen between China and Taiwan, because that would be catastrophic, not just for Taiwan, but pretty much for the majority of the civilized countries in the world, because I'm not sure that the world would just sit by and let something like that happen. It could be absolutely, like I said, catastrophic. So keep your fingers crossed. So I'm just going to put a little bit of Loctite on this gas block. The gas block on these guns does really very little, although it does sort of stabilize the barrel inside of the handguard. So we're just going to Loctite that down so that it's not flopping around inside of the handguard, like so. So we'll go ahead and put our handguard back together. You can see the threads are now inside of the handguard, which will allow the tracer unit to sit further in, which will give it a little bit of a shorter feel to it. Especially if you're playing indoors at close quarters, it definitely helps to have a shorter barrel on your airsoft gun. So tighten that down. The other screw in. Tighten that down. We're going to need to cut our inner barrel down, I'm sure, because it is now, the outer barrel is much shorter. So yeah, so that is now protruding beyond the end of the outer barrel, which will interfere with our tracer unit. So what we're going to do is just mark where we need to cut it, and we're going to cut that down and recrown the barrel. So this is where we need to cut it down to. Once again, we're just going to use our abrasive cutting wheel here. It's just a soft aluminum barrel, so it's not very difficult to cut down. Now, if you ever cut a barrel down, one thing you need to do is recrown it, because if there is any kind of metal hanging out in the middle where of the barrel where the projectile passes through, it's going to knock your accuracy way out of whack. So the way I like to do it, First thing I do is square off the end of the barrel nice so that it's got a nice even end of the bore. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a conical shaped grinding bit and we're going to re-bevel the inside of the barrel. So that is now beveled in there. And then after I do that, I like to give it a little bit of a polish so that there's absolutely nothing for the BB to get hung up on. And for that, I use a little polishing wheel, which I will show you shortly. Let's go ahead and remove this guy here. So this is a felt polishing bit, whatever you want to call it. We're going to use some polishing compound. So that's nice and clean. And then we'll just get a little bit of paper towel in there and just clean out any of that compound. You don't want to leave anything in there because it'll hang up on the BBs. And that is a recrowned barrel. So we'll go ahead and finish reassembling this. You need to have the little fake bolt carrier part in place before you put the barrel back in. So that slides in like that. So that is pretty much that. So now we have our new MOSFET system installed. We're going to put our new battery in here. And let's give it a test fire and see how it works. Sounds good to me. Let's go chronograph it. Got a nice snappy trigger to it now, and we're getting about 324 feet per second, which is perfect for what you want to have here in an indoor airsoft arena setting. So this gun is now pretty much ready for Freddy. We'll go ahead and clean it up, get it ready for the customer, and hopefully you'll be happy with this. So if you're interested in this particular build for your own uses, you could just watch the video and do it yourself, or we do these installations all the time. So if you want it done right and you don't want any excuses, bring the gun here and we'll do the whole thing from start to finish, and then you won't have to worry about any mistakes going on. So something to think about, and you won't void your warranty. So feel free to come on in if you have a particular build that you're interested in doing, whether it's, you know, a high-speed build or an HPA build, or you know, the only thing we really don't do is dual sector gears, because those just generally tend to blow up on you when you least expect it. So we generally try to stay away from those. But anything short of that, feel free to stop in and we'll be glad to give you an estimate on it and get the job done right the first time. So until the next time, don't let the bastards get you down.